Tales from Gloryland, Jericho Martin, by Mitchell Pfeiffer. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania was the place to be. It was a rising hotbed of industry and technology. Business was booming, and it made the top 10 list in the nation for average social score. Jericho Martin found that funny, considering the county's large Amish population probably hadn't been counted when they came up with that number. He knew firsthand those people were harder to track, harder to get a score on. Jerry, he hated the name Jericho, had come to be a security camera installer. He was in his early 30s, and he was good at what he did. His own social score, 9.21, reflected that, being quite a bit higher than even the local average of 7.38. People sometimes asked his advice on how to raise their scores, and he simply told them, take care of your community, take care of yourself, and love doing both. In the morning, Jerry got up earlier than he needed to. Ate a breakfast that included fruit and meat, drank a cup of orange juice, and listened to one of the many news podcasts that had insider access to federal departments due to their trustworthiness and journalistic integrity. He had completely cut out caffeine from his morning diet to stay healthy. He was always at the job site on time and was always meticulous in his work, careful to double-check everything and ensure zero mistakes. Security cameras get hardwired to the recording interface unit, the RIU gets hooked to the internet, and all footage gets stored locally inside the RIU SSD drives, as well as in redundant federal-owned footage backup facilities. From there, the Census Department could use facial recognition and trained AIs to automatically calculate and administer millions of social scores throughout the nation. It was a beautiful, interconnected process that only America could put together and make work. He took pride in being one of the small cogs in the wheel that made it function. For his part, he was a humble installer of surveillance systems, but he took pride in it nonetheless. Jerry had even been offered a job at the local Census Department data storage facility as a network and database administrator. He had an interview, got a tour of the facility, salivated over the hardware setup and the massive data storage racks, but ultimately decided that a desk job was not for him. He enjoyed being on his feet in the field much more, and that was the beauty of the government's guarantee that every citizen should have their pursuit of happiness. Even if Uncle Sam determined Jerry would be more useful in that database admin job, he had the freedom to continue installing surveillance with no penalty to a social score that he could perceive. The USA was a beautiful place. On a typical day, he checked out of work and went home after 10 or 11 hours, like most Americans. Getting home at 6 p.m. or maybe later was typical. The first thing he did at home was take a shower, always. That was the best part of his day. The warm water washing the filth down the drain was such a wonderful thing to see and feel, and the skylight in his bathroom let in a pleasant view of nature, which his neighborhood was still rural enough to have. In winter, he got home after sunset. The skylight would give him a foggy view of the moon, and he often didn't turn his bathroom light on during this shower, simply so he could look up and enjoy that view through the branches of the trees. He took advantage of living alone and often wandered around the house naked after his shower. There wasn't a need to worry about anyone else being offended by it. After preparing his usual microwave vegetable dinner, he sat down at his comfortable desk and computer chair, the part of his home in which the most effort and time had been put, and usually ended up doing one of the most entertaining activities he could think of: eavesdropping. One of the things that happily slipped through the cracks in this world was that the person who set up the customer's username and password on each RIU conveniently had access to the RIU for as long as they could remember the password. Jerry was that person, and there wasn't a unit in 10 years that he had lost the password to. Those RIUs were the key to an invigorating, voyeuristic experience that wasn't always sexual in nature. It wasn't just a look at street corners and parking lots. He could view into people's homes, their apartments, their living rooms, their lives. The best part was he could access the RIU storage and replay past events from the day. He even had the ability to save clips at his leisure. Seemingly nobody cared. To the contrary, he guessed based on his social score that the Census Department approved of this activity if they even paid attention to it. In all likelihood, no human had ever observed him in the act, just those AIs, and he was fine with that. His favorite subject of observation was a single woman, a few years younger than him, in a low-budget inner-city single-room apartment building 1 county over. It was complete with a communal kitchen and bathrooms. She was living with only her mother, which, when considering they shared a room, made it very cramped for them. The initial install, he remembered, was total hell. It was one of the earlier ones in his career. It was a seedy neighborhood, and they were putting a fresh system in an existing building. All the ceilings were drywall, so they had to cut holes in the ceiling to run wires, and then install access hatches wherever they cut. The rooms were dirty and sometimes contained drugs in the open on people's tables and beds. The walls were often slimy or greasy. The drywall was dusty, there was no air conditioning, and the smell was often of urine. It was hell, but oh, did it pay off. He lost count the number of nights he'd spent stalking. There was no better word for it, even when he tried to make it sound less conspicuous for his conscience. A woman named Gloria Maria Campbell Rodriguez. Coincidentally, she was one of the few people he could think of who could rival the religiosity in his own name. He was sure she would be just as annoyed with a name like Gloria Maria as he was with a name like Jericho. She was of average height, a few inches shorter than him, with long black hair, tan skin, fit, jogged every afternoon while carrying bear mace before her second shift job, did her best financially for her aging mother, yet stayed home at least half of her Sundays while the mom went to church, sometimes alone. Their sporadically scheduled days off work were usually the only times both of them were in the same room, as the mother worked day shift at a local convenience store. She herself worked, he had deduced after a fair bit of digging, at a different convenience store down the street from the one where her mom worked at. He dug hard to find her social media profiles too, although she didn't update them as much as he wished. He didn't update his much either, so he could understand. His fascination with her had started as nothing more than pure lust and infatuation, however, it had grown. He wanted to get to know her as much as possible. He wanted to be a positive influence in her life. He wanted to be there for her, to go to sleep and wake up next to her, to talk about sports or TV, or about how much they hated their religious upbringings. And the worst part was, though he knew she spoke perfect English, she only ever used Spanish when she was at home. He had even attempted learning some Spanish himself, just so he could try to understand her, but even after years of practice he couldn't understand everything she said. They just talked too fast, and he just learned too slow. His motivation for learning was too inconsistent. Jerry wanted to take her out to dinner, or to a baseball game, or do anything with her where they could speak English together and get to know each other. But what exactly could he do about it? Introduce himself as the guy who had been watching her and her mother through their security camera the past few years? He'd long ago resigned himself to his fantasies of meeting her being purely fantasies and never transitioning into reality. His feelings for her were why her mother's death last week affected him, if only a little bit. She had died perfectly. She had died peacefully in her sleep, and Gloria was the one who found her. As far as Jerry could tell, it had broken her. She tried acting like normal on the first day, skipped work on the second day, attended the funeral and called off work on the third, skipped on the fourth day and cried the whole night, went to work on the fifth day, then cried after she got home, and now he was watching her write furiously in a notebook on her bed, at the time when she would usually be walking to her sixth day of work. Maybe she had off. He didn't know. She had a Bible open next to her, which surprised him. He supposed in the worst times of their lives people could be forgiven for turning to something as stupid as religion. Bored by what he was seeing and tired from the week, he decided to go to bed knowing that tomorrow would be a wonderful Friday morning. Only one more day of work before he could catch up on sleep, then complete a few home repair items that had been on his to-do list for a while. Before getting in his work van the next morning and driving out, Jerry got a text from his trainee that he was sick and wouldn't be joining him on the job site. He had to laugh. This guy wouldn't last long at his company. He knew the sick excuse was bullshit, and that unscheduled sick days deduced from social scores, as did getting fired for aforementioned unscheduled sick days. Apart from the humor he got from that kid's imminent misfortune, he couldn't care less about not having a helper for the day. He liked working alone much more than he did working with others. He only lamented that he wouldn't be able to get as much done, being only one person. On the other hand, today was Friday. At least this week's job was local, he thought, as he navigated the back roads. It was a new housing development with a camera in every room like usual, and he was well on track to have it finished on time, so he was unconcerned with the lack of help. In fact, with this particular helper, he thought time might actually be saved by not having him here. He laughed at that thought and made a mental note to use that line in the next time he lost his temper with a new guy. Jerry pulled into the cul-de-sac. He was early, but Amish horses and buggies were already filling in the unpaved parking area. At least they were productive. It was hard to find a better roofer or carpenter than a bearded Amish guy, he had to admit. They generally kept to themselves, and he was happy about that much. As he got out and started unloading his tools for the day, there was a circle of them near him. They were being led in prayer by a man whom, aside from working construction, Jerry gathered to be a local pastor. Out of a vague and passive interest in what they were saying, he worked quietly as he shuffled items around inside his van so he could listen. They were praying for health, happiness, and prosperity for the people who were to live in the houses that they were building. Next, they prayed for a speedy recovery for Jonah's sister, who currently had the flu, and finally they prayed for a great dinner tonight, filled with laughter and family. All this, of course, they spoke in Dutch, and Jerry didn't let out that he understood every word of it. With a name like Jericho Martin, of course he grew up in a Mennonite house speaking Dutch at home, with 3 brothers and 2 sisters whom he no longer talked to. He had long since gotten away from that lifestyle, though. He had worked for ages to eliminate any trace of the accent, too. He hated the excessive and arbitrary rules. That segment of humanity was holding itself back. He thought most Mennonites were more advanced than the Amish, and assimilation was beginning to take its toll on Mennonite communities. There were still people who refused to use a motor or radio because of those things interfered with traditional values. His hypothetical kids, if someone ever talked him into having them, would be raised fully English. He would make sure of that. Jerry wanted to erupt on those people praying there, to tell them that they were living their lives the wrong way, that they were willingly crippling their own well-being. He knew it was ill-advised, however, and that many of them would put up a passionate defense of their way of life, so he kept his mouth shut and carried a ladder and a fresh box of wire into the skeleton of a home that the electrician had only just beat him to. The workday was uneventful outside of the Amish prayers that morning. That event, though, had stuck in his mind the whole day. It put a kink in his Friday, reminding him that there were still people in the world who thought that appealing to a higher power did any good. The highest power any person knew was their own government, and it was best that way. Human influence in the world was the be-all and the end-all. Nothing else could top it. People who thought otherwise were blind or in denial. Seeing as it was a Friday, Jerry decided he could afford to check out a little before 5 p.m., giving him just under 10 writable hours of work for the day. He had overtime from previous days this week, so the lost time didn't matter. He chose to get home early today, and was responsible enough to budget an affordance for that time. His social score and his reputation at work didn't get affected. He was smarter in that regard than most people who trained to be his helper at work. Going into his home, he got himself a small bowl of ice cream before his shower. He deserved it. He did good this week. He was a model American, someone who should be looked up to by all. A little extra sugar now and then could be allowed. After his shower, he put on sunglasses and took a walk around the small wooded area behind his house, down to the creek that ran through, marking the boundary between his property and his neighbor's. Nature was beautiful. The day was warm and sunny. There was no rain. It was Friday, and everything was perfect. When he was done with his brief nature walk, he went inside and sat down at his computer with his microwave vegetable dinner and prepared for his usual evening activity. Habitually, he checked on Gloria's camera. She wasn't in her room, and the notebook and Bible were closed on the small desk. Some of her mother's clothes had been moved out of the room, finally. It was good she was starting to get rid of that old stuff. It was just taking up space. Then a thought came to him. He hoped she would be able to afford rent now that she no longer had a roommate. As far from ideal as 2 people in a single-room apartment was, it would be very sad if she were forced to go homeless for a while due to losing her mother. The sadness wouldn't even be for him losing his ability to look at her. He would feel a lot of pity for her if that were the case. Jerry brainstormed ways to check up on her financial situation. He was sure there was some way he could do it. If she did need a little extra money, he had some extra in his budget. All he had to do was think of a way to get it to her without her knowing who had sent her the funds. It was a stupid idea, of course, and he wished he could just introduce himself without revealing the extent of his stalking, but life had simply given him an unfortunate situation. He clicked to the kitchen of the apartment building and saw Gloria waiting for something to heat up in the microwave while one of the other building residents used the stove. They weren't talking. Jerry got bored watching this after a few minutes and clicked away to view other things. A few more hours of browsing and one late-night work-related phone call later, he was ready for sleep. He logged into the camera system in the morning to find that Gloria had once again skipped work and had been laying around lethargically throughout most of the time he was sleeping. He sped through the footage from the past hours and found that she had, however, done a lot of furious writing in that book of hers towards the end of her restless night. He sped up to the present and found her finally asleep on the bed. As much as he disapproved of her laziness, he was worried about her. She was clearly a bit distressed by the events of the past week. He had no clue what he could possibly do to help her. At a loss, he turned his attention to other things for most of the day. It wasn't until the afternoon that he came back to watching her. She had woken up finally when he checked back. She had left the building, a check of the other cameras revealed. However, she didn't take her notebook with her. It was left laying open on her desk. He zoomed in on it. He could almost make out the writing. He took a screenshot. It was Spanish, of course, but nothing a little effort and a translator website couldn't fix. When he finished with it, he took a moment to read, having been so engrossed in the translation that he forgot to absorb any meaning. To my mother, I'm sorry I let you down. I'm sorry I never found a good man. I'm sorry I made it to 30 without giving you grandkids. I'm sorry we had to live in this shitty place for so long. I'm sorry our lives didn't turn out how you would have hoped. Believe me, my life isn't how I wanted it to be. And I'm sorry you had to die here. This is the worst place I can think of to die in. Please don't think that you did a bad job as a parent. You were the best mom I could have asked for, and I love you so much. I'm sorry to tell you now that without you here, I don't think I want to keep going. I don't have anything else to keep me going. It was always you. Now that you're gone, there's nothing else, nobody else, that I have a responsibility to take care of, and no hope for a future for me. I waited too long in life and wasted my chance at any other meaning. My purpose in life is done. Mom, please don't be sad for me. Please don't feel guilty. It's not your fault. Really, it isn't. It's the world's fault. But it's even more my own fault. I have a few final things I want to do now before I join you. I'll go do it at the pagoda. You always liked it up there. I'll scatter your ashes on the hill, then jump down off that ledge to see you again. I love you. I'm sorry. Your baby girl, Gloria Maria. While that was certainly an item to read, he had reread it multiple times before the whole meaning and message of it finally sunk in. Gloria Maria was planning to kill herself. Well, part of him didn't blame her. It might sound like a thing in poor taste to say, but she had already said it herself in that letter. She was in a bad living situation, bad job, bad score. She had missed out on her chance to find someone while she was young. She didn't have kids. The most significant person in her life was now gone, and none of those things were likely to improve in the near future. If ever he saw someone who didn't have a lot to live for, it was her. But that didn't mean he wanted her to die. He reread the note once more. Was she serious about that? Was she really going to do it, or was she just venting her anger into her diary? He put his head in his hands. She said she had some final things she had to take care of. That sounded pretty final, didn't it? That made it sound like she was close to actually going through with this. Gloria said the location where she wanted to do it. She said she wanted to scatter her mom's ashes at the pagoda, then jump off. He knew where that was. He could go there and wait for her, then stop her if she tried to jump. He could talk her out of it, talk her into life. This was crazy. This was insane. It would absolutely lead to him having to explain how he knew she would be there. But he had to do it. If he didn't, she would die. He tried to calm himself down. In all likelihood, she wouldn't show up. She would probably chicken out, or maybe she would just spread the ashes, then go home. He wouldn't even have to leave his car unless he saw her go near that ledge. But if she did try to jump, he would be there to stop her at just the right moment. If he played his cards right, he could pretend he just happened to be there and he wasn't a stalker at all. So what would he do in the meantime? Just wait there all night? It was certainly something he could do. He would have his phone to entertain him, complete with camera access as well as other apps. Getting up in the morning for work wasn't a worry because tomorrow was Sunday. He had to do it. He could be saving a life. That was more important than anything else. If she died tonight, and he could have stopped it, he wouldn't know what to do with himself. He forced himself up out of his chair. He didn't know how long she would be out and about doing those final things before she made her way up to the pagoda. He had to move fast. He felt like an idiot as he drove down Route 222 towards the city of Reading. Going there in the first place was something he immensely did not want to do, let alone going there for the purpose of saving someone who he had never even directly spoken to. What he was doing was crazy. There was no other way to put it. He was embarrassed before he even got close to it. The pagoda was a famous landmark on the big hill overlooking the city of Reading in the middle of Berks County, which neighbored Lancaster County, and had one of the worst average social scores in the nation by contrast to it. It was the dirtiest, saddest, scummiest city he had ever worked in. He supposed that's why they needed so many cameras. Despite his disdain for it, which only grew with each passing moment he spent there, he had learned to navigate its streets as well as anyone from out of town probably could. Most of the city was on a grid, and that was easy enough to navigate. As it went further east, though, towards and around the mountain, the roads became gradually more confusing. The path up to the pagoda from the bottom of the mountain featured no less than 5 hairpin turns, zigzagging through one of the few wooded areas for miles around. According to a plaque at the top, there used to be car races going down the hill. Jerry had no clue how they could have done it without several people crashing and getting injured every time. The street names, as well, seemed to be monuments to the past whose meanings had long been forgotten. He had lost count of how many roads had Penn somewhere in the name, as well as how many centuries-old churches he saw still standing. The whole atmosphere mildly aggravated him, and made him want to leave as soon as he possibly could. He had a mission to complete, though, and if he had come this far, it made sense to keep going a little further. Up and around each turn he drove, stopping once for a deer to cross the road. The streets contained as much traffic as you would expect from a Saturday evening, which annoyed Jerry even more. When he reached the top, after only a few minutes, he was greeted by lights and sirens and a police officer directing him past the parking area, urging traffic further on along the road. When he reached the top, after only a few minutes, he was greeted by lights and sirens and a police officer directing him past the parking area, urging traffic further along the road. Driving past, he saw an ambulance taking up 3 parking spaces in the cramped area, and someone on a stretcher being carried up to it. Everyone was standing around, except for the people moving the stretcher. None of the first responders were rushing urgently to tend the injured person. Was that person already dead? He didn't have time to stop and rubberneck. Cars were lining up behind him on the narrow road. He put his foot down on the gas and continued on. His first thought after realizing there might be a corpse behind him was that maybe Gloria wouldn't be able to jump today. Maybe she would have been forced to drive past the parking area like he had been. Then he remembered she didn't have a car. Still, he doubted civilian pedestrians would be allowed near the scene of a recent death. He passed another parking area around a large obelisk-like monument. Thinking fast, he swerved and pulled in so he could park there for a while. The people behind him on the road were probably annoyed at him. It would be good to let them pass him at least. He found a space and parked. Some other cars were parked in the same lot, and people had their windows rolled down talking to each other. He kept his own windows up. It was only then, staring up at the 50-foot-tall concrete totem, he admitted to himself the likely possibility that Gloria Maria was already dead. He arrived too late. She had already jumped while he was sitting in his car for an hour. He had come all this way for nothing. Jerry rubbed his temples and thought of ways he might be able to find out who was in that ambulance. He hadn't put the cameras in the pagoda, and he didn't know who had. He wouldn't be able to access that footage. He could drive by and try rubbernecking again, but he was sure police would get annoyed by that. He was at a loss. The only thing he could think of would be to obsessively check the website of the church that she and her mother always went to for funeral information. That might take over a day to show up, he thought. He wanted some way to find out sooner, but there was none, unless maybe he looked for a government site that announced local deaths, but even then. He grimaced and pulled his vehicle out of the park. It was time to go home, whether he liked it or not. This trip had been a failure. As he drove back past the pagoda's parking area, the way into the lot was no longer blocked. He quickly swiped up one of the few fought-over spots in the place. The ambulance was already waiting to pull out. He put his vehicle in park once again and hurried to step out, thinking to catch the ambulance driver before he was gone, but it was on its way before he could open the car door. Dumbly, he stepped out and locked the car behind him. Checking he had his key before closing the door, he stepped up to the sidewalk, next to which was a stone wall blocking a long drop down. Looking straight out, he was able to get a great view of the surrounding area for miles around. Looking down, there were subtle bloodstains on the walkway 40 feet below, beyond which was trash-littered brush. His hair stood on end. Then he pushed away from the wall and walked on. Ahead of him was the pagoda itself on the bottom of that wall, with stairs leading down to the base. He passed by the Asian-looking arch and strolled down the stairs, passing an old English-speaking couple and a group of half a dozen Spanish-speaking kids. Despite the situation and the obvious event that should have been a sufficient distraction for him, he found himself thinking about how much he needed to redouble his efforts at learning Spanish. Even without Gloria as a motivator, it was just a useful language to know. It was increasingly more useful than PA Dutch. He envied people who grew up speaking it at home. Why couldn't he have been bilingual in that language instead of the one he had? His foot hit the step on level ground with the pagoda's public entrance, and instead of going into what looked like a gift shop, he turned and continued down even more steps to his right. The walkway with the blood on it was down further. That's what he was interested in. Jerry looked out at the city as he walked. From up here, the shitty place almost looked sort of pretty. The stone and concrete buildings almost looked halfway decent when you were too far away to see how dirty they were. He found himself trying to recognize landmarks and get his bearings. He thought he saw the highway off-ramp that he used just an hour ago. From there, he tried to trace the path he took through the city, but got turned around once or twice. He was at the bottom step before he could identify much else. He let that activity go. Footsteps getting heavy, he wondered if looking out at the city and trying to trace the road she used was the last thing Gloria had thought about before jumping. He was strangely calm when he reached the sidewalk square that contained the blood. He was strangely calm when he reached the sidewalk square that contained the blood. It was a relatively small amount, just a few small blotches, but still sticky. All thought drained from his mind as he stopped and stared at it, emotions calm and neutral. After a while, he looked up at how high the ledge was above him. If someone jumped from here, it certainly would be deadly. At this, he thought to wonder if the jumper was still alive, and had only broken their legs or something. He pushed the thought aside as stupid then, because it was a far jump and the ambulance medics weren't rushing to save the person. In addition, wondering too much about this was stupid because he wasn't even sure if Gloria was the jumper or someone else. He was stupid for coming here. He turned and walked away. But then saw a crumpled up piece of paper on the ground next to a discarded fast food cup. Idiot that he was, he allowed curiosity to get the better of him and picked up the paper. Unfolding it, he was greeted by a sadly familiar sight. It was the page from her diary, the one he had seen on the camera. Apparently, she had visited her apartment one last time and ripped the thing out of the book so she could take it with her when she jumped. That was unfortunate. He stuffed the paper in his pocket and kept walking to leave. On his way back out of the city, for some stupid reason, he decided to make a couple detours. His first stop was a gas station where he got a large sugary drink, in addition to fuel for his car. Then he made a more important stop. Just a block north of Penn Street, one of the main roads in the grid part of the city, he managed to find street parking somewhat close to that church Gloria and her mother went to. The building was closed to the public, of course, behind a large iron gate with chains and a padlock, but Jerry still had an urge to just see it, if only from the outside. The building itself was large and impressive, one of the centuries-old ones that littered the city. Without leaving his car, he gazed at it and imagined the recently deceased woman walking down the stairs from the large front door after Mass let out. If he were a little quicker or a little less stupid, he could have saved her. She could still be alive. He might even have been able to go to this church with her tomorrow. He was thinking stupid thoughts again. No use dwelling on the past, he told himself. It was better to leave before he got more self-hating than he had a right to be. He keyed his car on. This place wasn't of great interest to him anyway. His next stop was only a few blocks to the south. It was the apartment building where Gloria had lived not too long ago. There was a gated-off alleyway where he had been allowed to park his work van while he was installing the cameras here. That gate was currently closed and locked, much like the one at the church. All these locked metal bars were another reason for him to hate this city. Back when he was doing the work here years ago, he remembered he had been on a first-name basis with one of the landlord's secretaries. At any given time, neither the landlord nor any secretary was likely to be on location unless something was going on. It was so stupid. He knew it was so stupid, but he wanted to stand inside that room that Gloria and her mother used to live in. He turned the car off and locked the doors once again as he got out. Driven by strange feelings he couldn't quite describe, he crossed the street towards 127 South 4th Street. In addition to cameras, Jerry's position at his company had once included electronic door locks, but he had since taken on a more specialized role. Some of the old job perks from those days remained to him, however. For one, the fob on his keyring still retained full access to nearly every door he had ever worked on. For testing purposes, of course. So when he got up the steps to the front door of the building, he simply held his keychain up to the fob reader and was rewarded with a green light and a pleasant beep. The lock clicked, and he pushed his way into the building lobby. To his left was a narrow hallway leading to that cooking area. He recognized one of the cameras whose view he regularly observed. To his right was a narrower stairway leading up to the residence floors. He went up. The room number was 3F. He would have to go to the 3rd floor. On his way up the first set of stairs, he passed a fat and smelly man in shorts and a stained wife-beater. He had to compress himself against the wall to squeeze by him, and unpleasantly made skin contact with his shoulder and gut. When he got to the 2nd floor landing, a familiar smell of urine like an old schoolyard nemesis reached his nose after years of being away. He groaned and turned quickly up the next flight of stairs, where the smell turned to an ambient scent of weed and cigarettes. Something which left him impressed and dumbfounded given the heavy presence of smoke detectors in the hallways and rooms. On his way up to the 3rd, he put hands on the railing and was greeted with the unpleasant sensation of cold and wet. He instantly drew his hand away. He didn't want to know what that wood railing was wet with. On the landing of the 3rd floor, the smell changed to mold and mildew, and the smoke smell changed to more of a subtle accent. He shook his head and walked through the door and down the hallway. To his left, he knew, would be room 3F. It was locked, of course, when he jiggled the handle, and the doors on the apartments themselves still had the old-fashioned locks with physical keys, but he'd done enough door work to have learned a few tricks. With a small, thin, J-shaped piece of steel that he kept on his key ring, he jimmied the latch on the door to come free of the strike, and it swung open with the creak of its hinges. He entered and closed it behind him. Though the room no longer had inhabitants, he thought some of the neighbors might be suspicious of a strange man peeking into the apartment of someone they had seen around in the hall the past few years. Turning to look at the room after shutting the door, Jerry was reminded how stupid this was. He didn't belong here. He shouldn't be here. He was technically trespassing, but he didn't care. He had been watching this woman for years, and he wanted to walk around the place where she slept and reminisce. The room looked even smaller in person. The clothes scattered all over left little room at all for walking. The wooden chair and desk looked old and barely standing. The blankets on the unmade bed were stained and worn, color faded. Laying on the bed in the open, though, was the Bible that Gloria had read from less than 12 hours ago. He could feel the muscles in his face contorting when he laid eyes on it. For some reason, though, he wanted it. He thought it would be something that reminded him of her. Thoughtlessly, he picked it up. It felt heavy. He was familiar with Bibles. They usually felt heavy, but he hadn't noticed some of the decorative brass on the cover, adding to the weight. He didn't have a bag with him to put the book in, so he decided he would just carry it outside when he went. And the time for him to go, he decided, would be soon. This place didn't hold him in the sentimental way he thought it would. The worry over getting caught here overrode any of the feelings resulting from knowing Gloria was dead. In addition, he could see out the window that it was beginning to get dark. He didn't want to be home too late, and he didn't want to be in this city too late. With twitchy fingers, he opened the door, locked it behind him again, then closed it and retreated back down the stairs in a conspicuous hurry. The drive home was quiet. He had chosen not to play the radio at all. The only sounds around him were the motor of the car and the wind passing over the vehicle. The lights from traffic in the opposite lane of the highway annoyed his eyes in the dark. The Bible and the piece of paper were sitting on his passenger seat the whole way back. He groggily remembered to pick them up and take them inside when he got home. Leaving them on the living room table, the first thing he did was change out of his clothes and collapse on his bed. He was asleep in seconds. He had a short, blissful moment when he first woke before remembering all of the events of the previous day. When he remembered Gloria, though, and thought back to his time in Reading, the events washed over him in a wave of gloom. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. Even though he had found that note on the ground at the pagoda next to the smear of blood, he thought he would start his Sunday morning by checking the camera footage of her room. By some chance, maybe she was there today, and he'd made a mistake in thinking she was dead. A brief burst of energy brought on by that possibility moved him out of his bed and over to his computer with incredible speed and determination. His excitement was for nothing, though, as he sped through all the footage on that camera since he took the Bible and saw no other motion at all. At a loss for any ability to get any new footage of her, he regressed to the comfort of replaying some of his favorite clips of her. This ultimately satisfied his surface urges, but did nothing for the underlying emptiness that he felt. He was left feeling sorry for himself and the state that his life was in. At a glance, his life was perfect, but he knew that he felt lonely. Professional success and esteem couldn't always fill that need for someone to live with. He didn't cry, but he did just sit in his chair for a long time and think about what he was missing. He imagined holding that girl, hugging her at night. He imagined kissing her and feeling her warmth press against him. He created whole fake conversations with her in his mind, where sometimes she would forget herself and say something to him in Spanish, not realizing she'd switched languages. He would so badly like to have that. And then he woke up, after having drifted off in his chair, and there was no possibility for his dreams coming true. He should have said something to her sooner, thought harder and taken more of a risk when it came to reaching out to her. Maybe he could have orchestrated some natural-looking meeting between the two of them and pretended that was really the first time he had ever seen her. Even if she rejected him, he still would have had the camera on her and would have been no worse off than he was now. But now she was gone. He switched over to that camera in her room, and nothing at all had moved. She was still gone. She would always be gone from now on. And so most of his Sunday was spent in his chair with only a few interruptions to eat and use the bathroom. When the sun was down and the clock ticked closer to its usual bedtime, he lazily picked himself off the chair and walked the few feet over to the edge of his bed, where he once again laid down. He'd come home from work the next day, having almost forgotten about the events that weekend. He'd been at the new housing development again, and that helper who took a sick day last week had been fired. Sweaty from the heat of the summer, he played some music and took a shower like normal. He was only reminded of the loss when he sat down for his usual evening activity and found Gloria's room unoccupied. Nothing had moved since his last being there, except for a pair of men, Jerry assumed police investigators, entering, looking around, then leaving. Not entertained by her old room, he opened the new browser tab and searched for the website of that church. He found it, translated the page to English, clicked around until he found congregational news, and confirmed his theory. Gloria Maria had a special funeral service in the church scheduled for Wednesday. Jerry made note of it. Part of him, for some reason he couldn't quite comprehend, wanted to go. He wanted to attend that church only once, and to see how they sent Gloria off to rest. He couldn't explain the desire even to himself, but he knew it was something he wanted. One quick phone call later, and he was scheduled for the day off work on Wednesday. It was amazing how much freedom he got when you went through the proper channels to request days off. Jerry laughed and shook his head as he hung up the phone, thinking about that helper who was fired. A good social score was not a hard thing to maintain. All that was needed was to be competent. He spent one more night browsing through strangers' home cameras, one more day at work, and one more night of the same, before Wednesday morning was upon him. Life was normal, and the familiar pattern he had gotten back into seemed a headache to disturb, but he had already scheduled the day off, so it seemed like he had a personal obligation to follow through with his plan. For the first time in a while, he showered in the morning. He brushed his teeth like normal, dressed nicer than normal. He had to do some searching through his old clothes in the back of the closet, finding a passable outfit. He combed his hair, ate breakfast, and almost forgot to check the mail on his way out the door. Distracted and not wanting to be late given the long drive, he set the mail on the table without opening any of it. And then he was away once again, on that highway into one of the worst cities in the nation. The traffic, once he got off the highway and again onto those grid streets, was particularly bad on this morning. He was frustrated counting the minutes on his car clock while sitting at standstills through several red lights, navigating closer than comfort through the sea of vehicles on the narrow roads, all for the sake of reaching La Iglesia. To add insult to injury, it was a Catholic church, too. If he'd been desperate to get away from his own well-meaning Mennonite community, he could only imagine how bad these rigid, dogmatic sheep could be when it came to their worship. By some miracle, he found parking. Filling the meter with coins that he had to dig from under the seat, he locked his doors and joined into the crowd of Spanish-speaking voices, filing through the now open gates and front doors from the sidewalk. The building was large and made of stone with stained glass windows, contrasting the normal, small, wooden church buildings he was used to. The air was hot and stuffy inside, even in the morning, unlike what he was used to. Fancy candle poles, expensive-looking rugs, and ornate decorations littered the place, offending Jerry's sense of humility. This church tried to show off too much. Even if God did exist, he wouldn't care for all those material things. It reminded him of the story of Moses and the golden calf. He managed to keep his mouth shut, though, rather than speaking and offending someone. Not that anyone here would be likely to understand him. He had yet to hear a single word of English since leaving his car. He found a seat near the back, a decent distance from anyone else, and stayed there, hoping not to be noticed or questioned. He had been worried about lateness, but it took another few minutes past when he arrived before everyone settled down. Looking around, he almost didn't notice some pictures of Gloria and her mom on the altar, surrounded by white flowers. For all the other attention-grabbing items that filled the room, he might have missed it. Churchgoers were taking turns up front to look at them. He followed suit, standing up and taking a place in line. A child in one of the pews was already complaining about being bored. He didn't need to speak Spanish to understand it. Jerry wanted to punch the kid. When the line moved along and allowed him his time in front of Gloria's framed photograph, he didn't know what to do with it. He just stood there and stared for a while. Then he reached out and put his hand on the frame, caressing the glass with his thumb. It was almost like he was touching her face. It was the closest he could ever get now to actually physically touching her. He closed his eyes, and he could feel tears coming. He fought to hold them back, and just barely did. There would be plenty of time for crying when he was home. It only took a second for Jerry to become painfully aware of all the eyes around him. None of them knew him. He didn't speak their language, and here he was, sensually caressing a photograph of their friend or family member, and getting teary-eyed while doing it. He quickly stepped away from the altar and let another person take their place at the shrine. He again took a seat at his place in the back, feeling more out of place than ever. It didn't take long for the rest of them to file into their seats, and then the priest, an old man in full traditional garb, stepped out from nowhere up to the podium. Jerry didn't know why he expected anything other than Spanish when the priest started speaking. Charisma could be felt in his voice even if he couldn't understand the priest's words. The congregation listened quietly and attentively to the sermon as the pastor soliloquied about the life of Gloria Maria. He used her full name whenever he said it. Catholic that he was, the priest must have loved that name. Jerry sat there in silence, sweat staining the armpits of his shirt. Why had he come here? He sat there for what amounted to 15 minutes, but felt like much longer owing to him understanding very little. Towards the end of it, he got better at picking up individual words that the man was saying, but could rarely decipher a whole sentence. After a while of speaking, the priest finally instructed everyone to kneel down and join him in group prayer. Even with his broken Spanish, Jerry recognized the Our Father when he heard it, and he muttered along under his breath in Dutch, the language in which he was used to speaking that prayer. The prayer ended, the priest spoke words, everyone got back into a standing position, Jerry silently berated the Catholics for their method of worship, and the organist started playing Amazing Grace, to which the congregation sang along in Spanish. When they were done standing, everyone took a seat again, and the priest spoke once more, giving what Jerry understood to be an invitation for people to come up to the podium and say some words about Gloria Maria. It took a moment before anyone volunteered to go up. Is this how it would be at Jerry's funeral? Would people hesitate to come speak about his life and death? Then he thought about it more and realized he didn't know that many people outside of work. His family, if anyone, would be the ones to organize the funeral event, and he hadn't talked to most of them in years. What would they say about him when his time came? He began to feel very uncomfortable, and decided to abandon that train of thought. A greasy-looking man, probably in his 40s, hobbled up to the stand and began speaking. It was a relatively short speech, and Jerry gathered that he had known Gloria from her job as a convenience store clerk. He ended his monologue, went back to his seat, and a few other people, one after another, took their turns. He gathered that at least 2 of them were cousins, and one had been one of Gloria's hall neighbors in that shitty apartment building. There was at least one person whom he wasn't sure of, though, purely for lack of understanding what was being said. Jerry, of course, did not speak. Rather, he sat there trying to pick out words that people were saying, and feeling as out of place as he ever had. When the ceremony was over, he breathed a sigh of relief. As he was walking out of the building, he realized that he hadn't seen a coffin anywhere, not even a closed one. Had she been cremated instead of buried? He silently applauded the Catholics for stepping away from that particular dogmatic belief, even if it was a very small step. The 21st century was a wonderful place he hoped they would find. As he got in the car to begin his long journey back home, his thoughts dwelled on Gloria's life and death. Jerry thought about how little he knew about her, or her family. He didn't know if she'd lived somewhere else before coming to Reading, or who her cousins were, or anything else other than the mother, church, and job. He was curious about other people she knew and their relationship with her, but not nearly curious enough to go seek them out and socialize with them. It was afternoon by the time he got home. He was already feeling drained, even though all he had done for most of the day had been sitting, either in a car or in a pew. He wished he had the energy left to work on something physical, some home improvement project that he had on his to-do list, but all he felt like doing was laying around. He didn't even want to look at cameras, didn't even want to pick a new favorite person to observe. He just wanted to sit and think. Opening the door, he saw right away the mail he had put on his table before leaving. Not thinking much of what he was doing, he picked it up and opened it. He remembered, after he slid the letter out of the envelope, that it was from the U.S. Census Department. That last time he had gotten a letter from them, they were offering him a desk job at the Lancaster branch office. He didn't imagine too many letters from this place had good news for people, though. He started reading. Jericho Martin, I'd like to congratulate and commend you on your attempted life-saving action in the case of Gloria Maria Campbell Rodriguez. Your concern for the well-being of your fellow citizens is admirable. Though your awareness of the situation was brought on by lustful coincidence, it nearly resulted in saving a life. An appropriate adjustment to your social score is currently being processed. I'd like to be the first to make you aware of the Census Department's Preemptive Action Unit, which monitors various surveillance sources for potential crime, risky negligence, and other unfortunate circumstances which could result in tragedy, and attempts to rectify these situations before they devolve. Your work in this case is of the caliber I would expect from any one of my senior officers, and so I'd like to offer you a job in service to our great nation. We are aware of your current salary and are willing to give you a 50% raise. In addition, if you accept the position, we will also send you a complimentary 36-inch monitor, 32 terabytes of additional data storage, and an upgraded PC processor and GPU. This position will also allow you to work from home. The position features a healthy pension and access to top-of-the-line government healthcare professionals. I realize you are quite attached to your current work as a surveillance technician. However, I believe your talents could be much better used in our department. As your body ages, you might also consider a position that is less physically demanding. We would like to have you in our department, and we look forward to hearing your decision. Please send your reply to the Lancaster County Census Office by email, phone, or via USPS. Wishing you all the best, Alan Lansing, South Central PA Preemptive Action Director. Jerry put down the paper and considered what he read. It was certainly a tempting deal, definitely worth consideration, and he was glad to have waited to read the letter until after the funeral. The job offer would have been on his mind the entire time, distracting him from the present. With the rest of the day free to him before he had to go back to his job, he had time to consider what his future would now be like. As he sat the letter aside, he realized he hadn't even gotten settled down yet since coming back home. He got out of his nice clothes and into a more comfortable state, got something that could pass for lunch from his kitchen, and carried it to his computer desk in the bedroom. Looking at his regular-sized monitor, he thought how tempting an upgrade to that would be. After putting on some music, he checked over the letter again and thought about each computer part that Alan had promised to upgrade for him: processor, hard drive, and graphics card. This would give him an enviable setup if he did take the deal. On the other hand, he liked what he did. He had fallen into a routine, and though he sometimes complained about the daily annoyances he faced, Jerry loved much more about his career tasks than he hated at the end of the day. He thought it over more as he browsed cameras, searching with some amount of futility for someone who could fill the void in his life that Gloria had left. A bigger monitor and better graphics card would make him very happy indeed while he was doing this. And to have this be his job, now that was an exciting prospect. He did worry about getting fat and lazy if he stopped working on his feet, but he supposed he would get old eventually, and if he passed up this opportunity now, who knew whether he would get another like it? Then he had another thought. The guy that wrote the letter clearly knew what he did in his free time and how he had come to find Gloria. That idea made him a little uncomfortable. He looked up to the corner of his bedroom ceiling at the camera that had always been there, watching over his bedroom for his own safety. He had nothing to hide, of course. He was involved in nothing illegal, and the camera would even serve to help cops catch any potential burglars that broke in, but it still made him uncomfortable. The idea that someone could be watching him this very moment, the same way he always used to watch Gloria. If this is what she would have felt like, he was happy he never told her. He was happy to have been late to meet her at the pagoda. If he told her how much of her life he had observed, how many of her private moments, she would have jumped for sure. In a sudden burst of emotion, he got up from his chair, used his surveillance technician's access credentials to get into the recording unit's compartment in the back of his closet, and then thought about what to do next. He wanted that bedroom camera off, he knew, and probably the bathroom as well. But should he switch off the entire unit, every camera? No, the one in the kitchen and the one watching the front door would be useful if there ever was a real burglar, and the ones outside would be a benefit to have for sure. In the end, he unplugged just those two, bedroom and bathroom, then locked the compartment up again and went back to his browsing. At the end of the night, he went to sleep, and in the morning, he went to work. The Amish carpenters were praying again when he pulled his van up to the job site 7 minutes early. His company still hadn't found a replacement for the new guy, who got fired last week, so Jerry was alone on the job again. Fine by him. He sat there for a moment with his windows rolled up so he couldn't hear what the group was praying about. He had a few minutes before his shift started, so he could afford to sit around for a short while. Gloria almost didn't even register at all in his thoughts, nor, surprisingly, did his new job offer. Instead, he was thinking about the audio recorder in his van, wondering what in all his years he had said in this vehicle that he wouldn't have wanted anyone else to hear. His new co-workers, if he did take the job, could very well have listened to every second of his drive time for the past years, as he had done for Gloria's bedroom time. He wrinkled his face, wondering if the Amish were still exempt from those surveillance rules. Being a camera installer, he would be one of the first to know if they suddenly needed surveillance on them. Mennonites weren't exempt, so even if they hadn't turned away from God, he wouldn't be free from being watched. It was a problem that absolutely nobody he could possibly talk to would have sympathy for. He cursed and gave a very silent, very quick prayer of his own before exiting the vehicle and getting to work. It wasn't until lunchtime that another van pulled into the unpaved job site driveway. It was a clean and polished one, long and black, one that clearly didn't belong on a construction site. Jerry didn't notice the men in suits who climbed out until 3 of them approached him inside the half-built house where he was working. "Mr. Jericho Martin?" Jerry looked down from above, exposed ceiling joists where he was pulling a trunk of wires. "That's my name," he told the men simply. In another context, he might have felt a bit nervous to get approached by 3 suited agents, but on a job site, the clean clothes made them seem as harmless as women or little kids. That would factor into his career decision as well. Did he want to be someone who was afraid to get clothes dirty? He would lose self-respect if that were the case, or at least he hoped he would. "We'd like you to come talk with us. Please step outside." Wordlessly and a bit frustrated at having to stop in the middle of what he was doing, Jerry climbed down the ladder and followed them. The dirt and gravel crunched under their feet as they crossed the drive over to the only clean vehicle in the place. The suit slid open one of the van doors when they got there and invited Jerry in. Tool belt still donned, he obeyed. The others followed him. The door closed behind them, and the engine started. Before he could wonder if they were taking him somewhere, the vehicle lurched into motion. "Where are we going?" he asked them. "Federal prison. You tampered with your own residential surveillance system."